A very warm welcome, literally a very warm welcome to this evening's discussion on a very important subject and one very relevant to the Victoria Memorial Hall collection in its centenary year. This is about capturing India, the early colonial artists, and their representation of Indian life in our core collection of paintings from the second half of the 18th century onwards, down to about the mid 19th. And many of you, probably all of you who have joined in this evening, have seen our iconic collection of paintings by artists such as the uncle and nephew duo, Thomas and William Daniel. We have also seen paintings by Balthazar Salvins and Johann Zofani, and a host of other colonial painters, not only British, but also from other parts of continental Europe, who came to India and interacted with Indian artists, Indian administrators, and they painted a series of works of art from the 1770s, roughly 1760s, 70s on, all the way down to the middle of the 19th century. And we have almost 500 such paintings. They are oils on canvas. At any point of time, only a few of them are on view. Most of them are in storage because we don't have adequate space to display all of them, but we try to rotate them from time to time as best as we can. And the real historical importance of these paintings is that most of them are prior to the coming of the camera. So they probably are one of the most critically important tools for reconstructing Indian life, Indian landscapes, and Indian people prior to the coming of the camera. So, and there is a lot of, obviously, I'm not going into this because that will be taken up by the panelists today. We have a very distinguished panel of scholars who have been working on this. We have Satyashika Chakraborty, we have Sujan Mukherjee, we have Tathagata Nyogi, and to moderate, we have Arjun Motwani. And this is all part of a project that is in collaboration with the India Foundation for the Arts, who in our centenary year, last year, have very kindly awarded us or earmarked for us 2 scholarships, 2 fellowships to work on the Victoria Memorial Collection. And this is one of these projects out of which this evening's panel discussion comes out of. So I'm not going into the various kinds of politics of representation involved in the depiction of Indians in such paintings, because I guess the panelists will talk about them in any case. So I will just welcome the audience. I will thank all of you who have joined in. It's great to have these distinguished panelists. And most of all, it's time now for us to formally acknowledge our gratitude to the India Foundation for the Arts, who have collaborated with us in a very significant year in our 100-year history for these fellowships. And I would request Arundhati Ghosh, my friend and colleague in the India Foundation for the Arts, to introduce this collaboration with the India Foundation for the Arts and this project, which this evening's panel discussion is a part of. So, Arundhati.
Thank you, Jayanto. Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight for India Foundation for the Arts to be part of this scholarship. And before I request my colleague Ritika to actually talk about the collaboration per se, just a few words about India Foundation for the Arts for those of you who may not know who we are. We've been around since 1995. We support various kinds of projects and implement them as well across the arts practice, arts research, arts education across the country. And in the last 26 years, we've made possible about over 750 such projects. And the outcomes of these projects, very importantly, as books, publications, exhibitions, productions, films are out there, archival material are out there in the public domain for you to see, to witness. But what's important is that for us, the collections of museums and archives, collections in people's homes, collections that have been created out of either passion or a certain kind of interest or a hobby over a period of time, has been very important. And for the longest time, we had seen that in our research grants, through the research projects, people make material that goes into archives and collections. In our practice, often people, artists, scholars, researchers want to work with material which is there in museums and archives. And we've always wondered whether we could put together a program that could facilitate this coming together, this intersection where collections can benefit from looking into freshly by new people and be able to tell kind of new stories. So that's really the archives and museums program that we have at IFA, that Ritika, my colleague Ritika Mishra, she's just joined our team. We're delighted to have somebody very new in the team itself. So Ritika, could I invite you to share what the program is about a little bit and about the collaboration per se? Thank you.
Thank you. So firstly, it's like really delightful for me to be, I've joined a little more than a month to be here, not only because today, I'm talking are part of the Victoria Memorial Hall, and my association personally goes with it to a long time, and many familiar faces also coming from Calcutta, so that's an added thing. And coming to the program, as Arinti mentioned, adding to that, so the vision of the AMP program itself has its own journey. So it started off, as some of you might know, as a fellowship. It was initially the Archival and Museums Fellowship. In 2018, the fellowship went under review, and post that, from April 2019, we have the Archives and Museums program. We call it a program, and under that, we have project implementation, foundation projects. So as Dr. Sengupta rightly said, so last year was the centenary year for Victoria Memorial Hall. And every year, like Victoria Memorial Hall has been one of the great collaborators for this project. The vision of our program has been always to, energize spaces and institutions like archives and museums. All across our country, we have a variety of archives of different scales and museums as well. But accessing those kind of still remains limited to scholars, some interested public, and the general public only how they are visiting a museum, seeing things as they are displayed on behind a wooden and glass cabinet. But what our intention was to really activate these spaces in terms of how these collections, they all have a story. There's a story behind how the collections are put together. The objects themselves have an afterlife. The main intention with which we wanted this program to reach out to more people by inviting both scholars and creative practitioners. So the outcomes can be of both kinds. One, the scholars can kind of continue with their own research interests by engaging with the collections, institution histories, whereas the creative practitioners can use the collections and the materials, create and question those and create newer kind of materials out of it. So they basically can act as points of departures for them. This year, I'm very glad, this is one of my favorite also collection from the museum. And this year this is the foundation project, and under our AMP and Arjun, we have this year as the project coordinators. And I am really looking forward to this presentation. And over to you, Arjun. I'll not take more time in terms of talking about the project. Arjun is the better person to talk about it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ritvika and Arundhati, Dr. Sengupta, all of you. And thank you also to the audience and all those who have joined us. So before moving on to our speakers, I'd just briefly like to introduce the project, of which, as you know, this discussion is a part. So my project is tentatively titled Capturing India, Early Colonial Painters and Their Depiction of Indian Life. And it's the result of a collaboration between the India Foundation for Arts and the Victoria Memorial Hall. Now, primarily as a part of my project, I'm looking at a particular collection of paintings, which we might broadly place under the rubric of early colonial art. That is, paintings prepared by Europeans who visited India during, let's say, the late 18th and mid 19th centuries. So that is before the heyday of British imperialism. And most of these painters, in fact, were attracted to India because it was an uncharted territory for them. And there was a growing demand in Europe for pictorial representations of Britain's new colony, about which everyone had heard and read so much, but which very few had actually seen. So naturally, a lot of the commercially successful artists who came to India, like, let's say, the Hodges, the William Hodges and the Daniels, they concerned themselves with painting the landscape and the architecture of India. And they produced vast oil paintings, some of which are there in the VMH collection. And also they produced printed books containing images of India. But there were also other artists who were fascinated by more seemingly mundane things, such as, let's say, the ordinary people, their vocations, the houses in which they lived, the kind of festivals they celebrated, and so on. And some of these were trained artists like Balthazar Solvins. Some of them were amateur painters like Sophie Charlotte Belnos, Charles D'Oyly, who simply sketched whatever they found interesting. And these sketches naturally contain a very large number of Indian figures who might, and these sketches contain a large number of Indian figures, and they might even be seen as early attempts at what we would now call ethnography. Because most of these paintings were also accompanied by, let's say, captions or other textual materials where the painters tried to explain to, let's say, Europeans back home what life in India was like or what Indian society was actually like. So as a part of my project, I'll be looking at both the paintings and also the textual materials whenever they're available to try to arrive at a more holistic idea of how these painters actually interacted with India. Now, as I said, this project is mainly concerned with these proto-ethnographic paintings. So of course, there are other paintings as well. Like there's a vast collection of landscape art. There are paintings of monuments and so on. But I'm primarily looking at these proto-ethnographic sketches, which is why the topic of today's discussion is the depiction of Indian people specifically. And I'll also be trying to look at some of the underlying political and cultural forces which inform this particular archive. So that's more or less the project in a nutshell. And I hope the presentations and the discussion today help us understand better and to help us understand some of the nuances of looking at this archive today in the 21st century. Because as we know, these paintings are almost a lot of them are 200 years old. So we will also be discussing how to approach them now from the standpoint of today. So I'm also, by the way, preparing a website to showcase some of these paintings, and especially some of the more obscure ones which people might not have seen because not all of them are on display. And I'll also be preparing a set of essays which will hopefully go up on the VMH website next month. So please try to read them if possible. And now I'll just move on to our speakers for today's evening. And of course, we are joined by Tathagato Niyogi, Satyashikha Chakraborty, and Srijan Mukherjee. So we'll start off with Tathagato. And Dr. Tathagato Niyogi is the co-founder of Immersive Trails, a purpose-driven company that makes travel and learning more accessible and enriching by translating in-depth ethical research into immersive in-person and virtual experiences. He's an archaeologist by training with a PhD from the University of Exeter. So now, Tathagato, if you would please present your talk so that.
Thank you, Arjun.
And just one small thing, sorry for interrupting you. So for all of those who have joined us, if you have any questions for the panelists or speakers, please just type them in the chat box. Once we are done with the presentations, we'd be glad to take up the questions and have a discussion on that. Thank you, Tathagato. Now over to you.
Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Jayantoda, Arundhati, and Ritika, and Isha. Thanks for having me here. So I have a very short presentation because after the walking tour this morning, I had a very bad migraine. So I could not, I don't think I should stare at the screen for a long time. So I'll share my screen and I'll start off. Right, so I'll be talking about Balthazar Solvins and his depiction of craftsmen in his etchings, and I have compared some of his work that like his etchings that he produced in India, as well as some that he produced, like reproduced in Paris. But before we go there, let me introduce Solvens to you. So Solvens was a Flemish artist. He was born in Antwerp in 1760, and there he was trained in art, and he gained an early popularity as a marine painter, so painter of ships. He came to India in 1791, and he came to India at a very exciting time. So he learned about India, he read about India, and he got really interested in experiencing and probably sketching the exotic Indian images, landscape, as well as people. And he also heard about the amount of the amount of money that is to be made if in India as a painter as well. So he comes to India in 1791, and he was instantly influenced by the research, the work that was going on in the Asiatic Society. He was very much influenced by William Jones, who he admired. And he was also coming to India at a time when colonial epistemology about India, the knowledge systems about India that was coming up, that was getting constructed. The idea of India and India and its people were getting constructed in the minds and in the writings of the colonial state and about the country. So here he decided in 1794 that he will start his project of etching and depicting different aspects of Indian life. And by 1796, he had produced first set of 250 colored etchings, which were published as book in 1796, and more etchings were added in 1799. But unfortunately, this was not an economic success, a financial success for him. And then in 1803, he goes back to Paris, to France, and there between 1808 and 1812, he redid some of his entire compendium of paintings and published as prints in several volumes, and which unfortunately was also not a commercial success. Later, he would become successful in his career, not as a painter, but probably because of his long work in painting. He was given a position in one of the ports in Netherlands, and he would become a success. He would live out rest of his life over there. So in order to talk about his paintings, we have I have looked at the depiction of craftsmen, and basically if you look at his paintings, there is, if you look at the craftsmen that he tries to depict in his paintings, the craftsmen basically, it's the background scene that actually tells you about the craft. So about what the painting is about, what craft that you are talking about, that he is trying to depict. So the foreground scene is just of an ethnographic sketch of a man, mostly he depicts men, and as a man who is just standing, and you would see this repeating constantly in the paintings that we see. And it's actually the background, what is going on in the background, that gives more description about his craft. And he also adds aspects of the Oriental scene. So you see huts, you see a lot of Oriental figures doing different things in the background as well. And what he stands out is he pays very close attention to the dresses, the way people dress, and that is what I personally find fascinating in terms of depiction of various people, including craftsmen and also he pays attention to the workshop, like what is going on in the workshop, or what kind of equipments they're using, and etc. So this is a painting, for example, of a carpentry workshop. A carpenter is painted more in the foreground as this huge figure, and then But the carpenter figure here is doing nothing. It's just an ethnographic sketch of someone standing. But in the background, you can see the actual work going on. And when this same painting is reproduced in the Paris version of his paintings, you would see that there is a skin color is changing to becoming more darker. I'm not sure if this is for the materials that he was using to etch them in Paris. And also you will see that there is more more of the background becomes visible. So more things are going on in the background, more people are visible in the background. So it's becoming more crowded. Similar thing happens over here, where this is the painting of a basket maker, and you will see there is emphasis on the dress. The figure itself it's not doing much except for holding some reeds to make the reed baskets, but on the background you can see basket making at work, and also various equipments that have been used, that is used for basket making. And also in his paintings you generally see like in the Paris version you can see extra figures as well. So there is someone over here working as well. So this is again a depiction of a blacksmith's workshop, and again you can see a complete change of skin color, like skin tone, between the main figure over here and the blacksmith figure here, and also the size of the figure, the scale of the figure is much bigger on the paintings that were produced in Calcutta, compared to the painting that was reproduced in Paris as well. So this is a painting of a rope maker, and you can see there is again the same thing, but here the difference in skin color is not as like this is pronounced, but it's not like it looks flipped from the other paintings. You can also see that the like you can basically compare these and see there's more activity happening here in the Paris painting, and in the Calcutta version of the painting there are people in the background, but they are mostly in not very well defined, but you can see the materials that have been used, and these are very valuable for ethnographers like me who study ethnography of craft production, to try to understand how the craft production, like how materials that have been used for producing a certain craft has evolved over time or have not evolved over time. So this is a painting of the potters, and you can again see the similar kind of differences in both the paintings from Paris on the right, and from Calcutta on the left. This is a painting of a Patua or Potachitro painter, and also you can see a Durga idol being made at the back in the house. And here in the one in Paris, you can see it to be more pronounced as well. And this is this is a painting of almost lost craft tradition, which is the maker of the cutter of conch shell and producer of conch shell art. This is the net that they use to get the conch shell from the rivers and ponds and all of that. And then you can see at the background there are some people cutting the conch shell and shaping them into art, various forms of art. So this is more or less this form of craft has more or less vanished in Bengal. So these paintings also provide a very good insight into like sort of what kind of how the entire technology worked, what was the chain operator or operational sequence of the technology, and we get to know a lot about like these paintings provide that visual insight into how it worked in its heydays that time. And this is the final painting that I want to focus on, which is the painting of a weaver, and it more or less looks like a same sort of loom that you see today if you go to Bishnupur and other places. And so there is, it gives you a comparative sort of understanding of this of the paintings. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry for being a bit garbled. I'll stop sharing my screen and I will also switch my camera off.
Okay. Thank you, Tathagato, for this really wonderful presentation on the depiction of craftspeople and especially the kind of detailed backgrounds which solvents often sketched for them. So before, I think we can take this up in the discussion later on. So before that, let's move on to the next speaker, who is Shotoshikha Chakraborty. Shotoshikha is an assistant professor of history at the College of New Jersey. She did her PhD from Rutgers University in 2019, and her research focuses mainly on the history of domestic labor at the intersection of gender, race, and caste. And more broadly, she's interested in the history of the British Empire, colonial medicine, and visual culture. Her research has been funded by predoctoral fellowships from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And recently, she curated an exhibition at the TCNJ Art Gallery on the visual culture of domestic labor through trade cards and posters, through trade cards and postcards from the age of new imperialism, Jim Crow racism, and Asian exclusion. So I would now request Shotoshikha to make her presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Arjun. You guys can see my screen, right? Okay. Okay, so I'll be talking about the representation of Indian ayahs in early colonial art, and I'll mainly focus on oil portraits by European artists. So last year, the Met Museum in New York acquired this oil portrait of an Indian ayah. And if you guys can look at the inscription on the top, it identifies the subject as Joanna de Silva, and it states that she's a native of Bengal, the faithful and affectionate nurse of the children of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Trier. And it was painted by William Wood in 1792. So William Wood was an English painter who had actually never been to India. It turns out that Joanna de Silva, this woman, she was the one who traveled to England with the children of Colonel Trier, who was an officer in the East India Company, and he actually passed away while fighting Tipu Sultan's forces in Seringapatam. Ayahs were an exceptionally mobile group of South Asian women who traveled from India not only to Britain, but also to other parts of the British Empire, providing domestic care labor to British women and British children, particularly during the long ship voyages. In this time, like from India to Britain, the ship voyage took more than 6 months. From the name of this woman, Joanna de Silva, we can assume that she was probably Indo-Portuguese. And many ayahs in the 18th century were of mixed parentage, Portuguese fathers and South Asian mothers, in this case, probably a Bengali mother. Ayahs were the only South Asian women who were depicted so frequently in European oil portraits and also in family conversation pieces. Despite being the central subject in this expensive oil portrait, thank you. Despite being the the main subject in this oil portrait, we know very little about Joanna de Silva, who she was, anything about her life. However, from the pearl jewelry on her hair, and also the elaborate necklace, earrings that she is wearing, we can assume that her employers wish to highlight her exoticness and also their kind treatment of her while commemorating her service to the family. So this portrait is actually quite unusual in depicting the ayah by herself, sitting for her own portrait. Usually ayahs were depicted along with the British family or British children who they took care of. One of the earliest depictions of an Indian ayah in oil was commissioned by Edward Cruttenden, who was a director of the English East India Company. And this painting was commissioned to the famous English painter Joshua Reynolds, who himself was a shareholder. He had stocks in the East India Company. And Reynolds had also never been to India. And the ayah who is depicted here was one of the 4 Indian servants who had sailed from Calcutta to Britain after Mrs. Cruttenden passed away in the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta. And she took care of the 3 Cruttenden children who are also depicted here. In European family portraits in the 18th century, servants were typically not painted at all, or if they were painted, they were usually painted on the margins so that they would not be confused with the family members. Servants could easily upset the class hierarchy within the painting, so they were not painted. But Indian ayahs, as we can see in this painting and other paintings, as we will see, were often depicted quite centrally within European oil portraits, group portraits, conversation pieces. Here, for instance, the ayah is at the apex of the triangle, and she's placed literally in the center of the painting. Right? So her exotic presence was highlighted in the painting because the presence of the ayah showcased the British family's affluence, their imperial connections, in a similar way as other imperial commodities, for instance, Chinese porcelain or Persian rugs or Burmese teak furniture. While the Cruttenden daughters, the 2 daughters, we see them looking back at the viewer. The ayah, she's depicted with downcast eyes to indicate her servility. And this was a common artistic trope used by Joshua Reynolds in other portraits as well. For instance, in this painting, also by Joshua Reynolds, the ayah is placed again in the center of the painting, but she's kneeling and her, with downcast eyes, which shows her subservience to the British family. But the ayah in this painting was probably a woman named Bola, and she accompanied George Clive and his family to Britain from Madras. And this was painted by, again, Joshua Reynolds, who was commissioned by George Clive, as we can see here. And race was materially inscribed in many of these oil portraits of Indian ayahs. So the pigment that was used to depict Indian skin color was called Indian yellow. And this yellowish brown, dark brown pigment, and Jordana Bilkin and other scholars have written about this. Indian yellow was a product of colonial labor, right? So the pigment used to depict the skin of Indian servants was also produced by colonial labor. Just like indigo, the pigment which was used to depict the tropical foliage and background, Indian yellow was another colonial pigment, which was made primarily in Bengal and Bihar by drying the urine of cows who were fed on an exclusive diet of mango leaves, and many of these cows died in just a couple of years. And this is before the emergence of scientific racism, and we can see how race is visually produced in the painting. The ayah's dark skin and her subservience highlights the racial purity and also the racial superiority of the British family that she serves. The ayah's presence also highlighted the sexual respectability of the imperial family. And this was a time when mixed race relationships between British men and South Asian women and half-caste children were becoming morally embarrassing for the British Empire. And the presence of the Indian Aya, the racialized, otherized Indian Aya, emphasized the racial purity and the sexual respectability of the British family. And if you look at this painting, you can see that the Aya is quite well dressed, just like the previous paintings that we saw. A lot of jewelry, necklaces, hair ornaments, and gold rings on her fingers. It is unlikely that Ayas would possess so much expensive jewelry or even wear them on a daily basis. So clearly these paintings were staged, performed to highlight the benevolence of the British empires, of the British imperial family. And East India Company officers at this time had acquired a dubious reputation in Britain as highly corrupt and exploitative towards their native subjects. George Clive, who was the patron of this painting, was a nephew of Robert Clive, the first governor of Bengal. And we know that Clive's policies were largely responsible for the Bengal famine of 1770 that wiped out a third of Bengal's population. And in 1772, the British Parliament started an inquiry against the East India Company for financial corruption. And Clive in particular faced a lengthy parliamentary trial for the immense personal wealth that he had accumulated by plundering Bengal. And although he was acquitted, Clive was publicly humiliated and he committed suicide in 1774, I believe. And this was taken by the British public as proof of his guilt. Even those who had been opposed to parliamentary interference in the East India Company's affairs, the champions of the free trade, now demanded greater governmental regulation to make the East India Company and the company officers financially accountable. So in this kind of political situation, the bodies of Indian servants, particularly Indian ayahs, also became canvases to showcase the benevolence and paternalism of British employers, how kind they were to their Indian subjects and dependents. Okay, so in the 1780s, a number of European artists started arriving in India with the hope of acquiring commissions from the upwardly mobile East India Company officers who had made a lot of wealth in India. And one of the most sought after painters in the late 18th century in India was Zoffany, who was trained in Italy and Germany. And he arrived in India, I believe, sometime in 1783. And Warren Hastings, the Governor General of Bengal, immediately became his patron and commissioned him to paint a family portrait with his wife, Marian, and her Indian ayah. And this painting may look familiar because it is from the VMH collection. The dark ayah, we can see here, she's dressed in a dark brown gown, and she kind of stands as a foil in the background, offsetting the racial purity of Marian Hastings in her bright, radiant yellow gown. But the ayah, we can see, even though she is kind of juxtaposed, her darkness and the racial purity of Marian Hastings are juxtaposed, she is still dressed quite richly, almost as richly as her mistress, with the pearl necklaces around her neck and the silver bordered shawl, and also the bejeweled shoe that she is wearing. So this portrait was commissioned by Hastings just before he left Bengal, and was probably meant to showcase to his metropolitan friends the status of his imperial life and also his benevolence towards Indian domestic servants. However, just like Clive, Warren Hastings was also accused of corruption, and basically British public anger against the East India Company needed a new villain in the 1780s, and Warren Hastings became this figure. And we know that he was impeached in the parliament, and Warren Hastings' 7-year-long impeachment was one of the biggest political public spectacles in late 18th century Britain. And Edmund Burke, who started the prosecution of Warren Hastings, he and I can quote him, like he said, I impeach him in the name of Indian millions whom he has sacrificed to injustice. I impeach him in the name and by the best rights of human nature, which he has stabbed to the heart. So basically, he was accused of being this highly corrupt and immoral figure who had exploited Indian subjects during his time in Calcutta. Throughout the years of Hastings' theatrical impeachment, and even after his financial ruin, his personal papers and letters show that Hastings was still providing for his Indian servants. And the letters show that one ayah named Peggy, probably the woman in this painting, was still receiving her pension from the Hastings as late as 1813. So almost 3 decades after the Hastings had left India, she was still getting a small pension from them. So Hastings' continuation of this paternalistic relationship with his Indian ayah, decades after his departure from India, suggests that the image of a moral, benevolent master must have been emotionally important for him in the aftermath of the humiliating impeachment and public charges of dishonesty and corruption. So Hastings' friend was, of course, Elijah Impey, the first Chief Justice of the Calcutta Supreme Court, who also commissioned Zoffany to paint his household in Calcutta. And this painting is quite interesting. It's more of a conversation piece, and it's quite informal, as we can see. Mrs. Impey, Lady Impey, is seated on a chair, and the 3 Impey children are also depicted, and the youngest is on the lap of one of the 2 Indian ayahs. And this is a band of strolling musicians and also Indian men servants who are depicted. And one of the daughters of the Impeys, she's actually depicted here in the costume of a Nautch girl dancing, right? Which again shows the, kind of appropriation as well as respect for Indian traditions and culture in the late 18th century, something that would no longer be there in the mid 19th century. So European artists were not the only ones getting commissions from East India Company officers. So around the same time that the Impeys commissioned Zoffany to paint their household, Lady Impey in 1784 commissioned the Murshidabad painter Zainuddin to also depict her household with Indian servants and also the nursery with the 3 Impey children depicted here, along with 5 Indian ayahs and 2 dogs. Right, so Indian artists who were trained in Mughal courtly style, they were also courtly paintings. They were also painting for European patrons. And there's a lot of writing about this kind of art. I won't go into much details, but this one is particularly interesting because it shows Lady Impey seated on a chair here, and the Indian domestic retinue, a lot of men servants are scattered around her, almost like commodities, highlighting her, imperial femininity. Like she rules the household just like her husband rules the empire. And not only the Impeys, but several other, East India Company officers were commissioning Indian painters to depict their household. And in these kinds of paintings, the figure of the ayah often features. For instance, here we see this is a miniature in ivory, which was commissioned by Sir John and Lady Login from Punjab. So, and we can see an Indian ayah carrying the youngest child. And, this, again, we don't know who this Indian boy, he may be the son of the ayah or who was a playmate of the 3 children. And so some of these paintings were commissioned, but mostly East India Company men who could not, like soldiers and other British or European people in India who could not commission expensive oil portraits or even Indian paintings, would collect sets of paintings produced by Indian painters, usually on mica. Right. And again, in these kinds of sets, Indian servants, particularly the figure of the ayah, was frequently depicted. And you can see the style is very different, of course, from the oil portraits that we saw. And the British children are depicted almost like in miniature form, like miniature adults, like we can see here, right? And in many of these paintings, once again, we see the ayahs wearing elaborate gold jewelry. And we can talk more about, why the kinds of depictions we see here. And as Tathagata or June were talking about the ethnographic value of early colonial art, I think we can see that also in these kinds of Indian paintings for company patrons, just like, Balthasar Saltin's Prince, which Tathagata talked about. In Saltin's Prince, the figure of the ayah and also the Indian amma, who was a wet nurse to for British children, defigured. I believe this is the French version, not the Calcutta one. And so not only, so Solvins was, of course, an unsuccessful painter who came to hoping to get expensive commissions from East India Company officers, but having failed to do so, he turned to these kinds of prints and etchings, which a lot of amateur artists like Charles Diley and Sophia Belnos. Charles Diley, we know, established the Bihar Lithographic Press. And in his one of his watercolors, we also see an Indian ayah, an Indian servant, and with her British employers. And Mrs. Belnos also in several of her paintings. We see Indian servants, particularly Indian ayahs, being depicted. And so these paintings were very different from the oil portraits that we were seeing, right? Because these were published, these were mass reproduced, collected widely, turned into etchings, lithographic prints. And these were, so Europeans who had never been to India could get a sense of what Indian servants or Indian women looked like from these kinds of images. So their value was more proto-ethnographic, to quote Arjun. The oil portraits, on the other hand, were not really ethnographic because they were privately viewed in the commissioner's own home, or only by close family members and friends who could see them. But at the same time, oil portraits with Indian ayahs were important tools of empire, were important tools of self-fashioning. And unlike the prints and watercolor or the Indian paintings for the British, we can see that ayahs in the oil paintings were really individualized. Their facial features were rendered with careful attention and detail. So this one is from 1785 and was painted by Thomas Hickey, who arrived in India around this time. And it was commissioned by by Stephen Sullivan, one of the directors of the East India Company, who was also a friend of Warren Hastings, to paint his toddler son and his ayah. And we can see that the ayah is depicted in a silk sari and again, lots of elaborate ornaments. So something interesting in many of the oil paintings is the chiaroscuro technique that was deployed by the artist. The careful play of light and shadow was used to again highlight the racial difference. We can see light coming from some unknown source and falling on, the young Lawrence Sullivan, making his whiteness all the more irradiant and glowing, whereas the ayah or who is already dark appears more dark because she's kind of placed in the shadow. And something very similar we see happening in this painting, which was painted by Thomas Hickey in Madras. We don't know who the sitter is or the commissioner is, but again, we can see the whiteness of the young British child highlighted, and his innocence, kind of purity, whiteness, all these things being highlighted through the careful play of light and shadow. And the ayah she kind of blends with the drapery in the side. And we can see this kind of chiaroscuro technique deployed in a lot of paintings, oil portraits at this time. So these are unfortunately in black and white. Like, I took photos from the black and white version of the actual colored paintings. So this one, yeah, we can see again like the two children. This is by Thomas Seton, and the children are depicted along with the mother in a much lighter skin tone, whereas the ayah, she kind of blends with the background, just like in this painting by Sarah Baxter. So actually, this one was painted by the mother, Sarah Baxter. She was one of the very few female artists painting in late 18th century Calcutta. She depicts her son on the lap of his ayah, and another Indian servant, probably a bearer, is seen on the side. And again, and this follows the tradition of more, of European oil paintings, where servants are made to blend with the background or on the margins to highlight the presence of the main subject. Okay. Apart from the play of light and shade, another way to highlight racial difference in these oil portraits was by the placement of the individuals. So you can see in both these paintings, one by George Duncan Beechey, who was the court painter of the Nawab of Awadh. So probably sometime in 1840s, he was painting this. And this is again by Thomas Hickey from Madras, 1790s. In both of them, we can see the ayah placed, like not only below the adults, the British adults, but also like below the British children. Even the shortest British child's head is kind of above the ayah, right? Here also, this is a christening party of a child with his parents and godparents, and the ayah is kneeling down beside. So again, we can think of how these techniques were used by artists to show a racial difference and how race was kind of produced in the paintings visually. Okay, so I'll end with a few paintings from 1857, like after the 1857 Indian Rebellion. The figure of the Indian ayah came to be greatly sentimentalized in British literary and visual culture. A lot of mutiny novels, letters, diaries of British men and women were, wrote about the selfless devotion and love and the sacrifice that Indian ayahs supposedly, made towards for protecting the British children in their charge during the 1857 rebellion. In some cases, even when the husband or the son of the ayah was a rebel, was a sepoy, she still supposedly remained faithful for the British family that she took care of. And in 1858, a year after the rebellion, in commemoration of the mutiny, several paintings were done by British artists who had never been to India. For instance, Ibrahim Solomon's painting Flight from Lucknow shows an Indian ayah carrying a sleeping British child on her lap as the family escapes from Lucknow. And once again, we see that chiaroscuro technique where she's placed under the shadow of the tree to make her appear more darker, where on the other hand, light falls on the British women and the child, highlighting their whiteness. And this one by Joseph Patton shows a group of British women hiding to escape from the 1857 rebellion. And here we see an Indian ayah who identifies more with the British family than with her countrymen who are rebelling right? So this painting is interesting because initially in the original version, a group of Indian soldiers, Indian sepoys were shown to be coming in, right? But that had the suggestion of sexual assault by Indian men against British women. So in later version, the Indian sepoys were replaced by Scottish Highlanders who supposedly came in and rescued the English women. And from this period, like from 1850s and in the post-1857 period, the ayah-child relationship came to be greatly sentimentalized in European oil portraits. And we can see in paintings like this, Alexander Grant, who was the vice chancellor of the Bombay University, and this painting was commissioned to an unknown painter, and we can see his son on the lap of his Indian ayah. Similarly, here we can see George Forestry's son on the lap of his Indian ayah, and this was actually painted in New Zealand, which shows the mobility, the transnational mobility of Indian ayahs at this time. But this became a very familiar way of representing Indian ayahs, the ayah and the child, and this was greatly idealized, and and this was a time when photography was emerging, right? 1850s, 1860s, photography was becoming popular and oil portraits were becoming less and less popular. But oil portraits from the early colonial period depicting the Indian ayah kind of set the template for visual depictions of the ayah in the late colonial period. And in, like in children's literature, missionary literature, like Ayah and like Edith and Her Ayah, which was a short story published in 1872, we can see again this ayah-child, relationship being glorified, and also in photographs and postcards from the late colonial period, from the early 1900s in particular, postcards depicted this ayah-child relationship in a very sentimentalized, emotionalized way. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Shobhashika, for this really brilliant presentation and such a wide range of ayahs, starting right from Zoffany in the 1760s down to the 1870s. It's a spectacular range of paintings. So thanks a lot for that. We also have questions for you. I think Arundhati Ghosh has asked something. So, but I think we can take up the questions once we are done with the discussion, once we are done with the presentation. So that would be great. So now if we could move on to Shujan for his talk. Shujan Mukherjee, he is currently working as a postdoctoral fellow under the Andrew Mellon Foundation project, Decolonization, the Disciplines and the University at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. He did his PhD from the Department of English, Jadavpur University, as a SIL fellow. And he has been working on memory and urban studies. And he has headed research and development at the DAG's Museum Initiative. He has worked at the Victoria Memorial Hall, the Gurusade Museum, and also Jadavpur School of Cultural Texts and Records. He has also previously worked with the India Foundation for Arts. He received the Arts Archival Fellowship in 2014. And apart from that, he has also been publishing in academic journals on history and literature, and he contributes frequently to the Telegraph, Scroll, Dak Bangla, and ISAP Art. So now, Shujan, over to you, if you would like to begin your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Victoria Memorial Hall. Thank you, India Foundation for the Arts and the Goethe Institute for hosting this event, and Arjun's fellowship, which I'm really looking forward to seeing culminate in something wonderful. Thanks also to Tathagato and Shottashika. Early morning, brilliant presentation. So and a tough act to follow. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this discussion put together by Arjun. Personally, as he said, it feels like coming full circle, not once but twice, because been previously associated with the India Foundation for the Arts' Archival Fellowship and with the Victoria Memorial Hall. And I'm sure there'll be time and occasion later to return to both over the years. The thoughts and observations I'll present to you in the next 15 minutes are not the result of systematic or disciplined engagement with early European painters in India. I won't call them preliminary because that assumes that there'll be something following up. I mean, they might just remain at this stage for an uncertain amount of time. I don't know whether, I mean, they have the kind of potential to be developed into something more fleshed out. These ideas or questions rather are born out of my personal fascination with these artworks, as well as occasional references I had to follow up as part of my doctoral research, which was on colonial memory, monuments, and public spaces. And a large part of it was encouraged by my former role at DAG's Museums Initiative, where along with my colleagues, we tried to think of new ways in which these artworks could be curated and recontextualized and made relevant in ways that may or may not have been intended by the artist. If time permits, we can get into these discussions later as well. But for now, I'm thrilled that Tathagata and Chattoshika have both offered very interesting, nuanced and very unexpected ways of looking at these artworks as an archive, not just ethnographic, but an archive, as it were, of the colonial gaze and how it kind of changes across time and across different forms. My primary concern is with the negotiations that European artists had to make as they attempted to represent a landscape, a people, and an architecture. Indeed, whole civilizations and ecologies that were foreign to the aesthetic they were used to working with. This is interesting to me because first, these artworks offer insights into our own assumptions about landscape and our ideas about the picturesque. Visual habits, if you can call it that, that have been so hardwired through convention that we barely even notice them today when we photograph urban, rural, or sublime landscapes. I mean, on tours and travels and so on, or in the way that, you know, travel brochures would feature them. These habits and assumptions are visible even in the painters themselves, the kind of, you know, the grasp that these traditions have, this kind of visual tradition has on artists. As the works of earlier generations seem to hold significant influence over later painters. And second, I find this encounter between a highly sort of codified aesthetic, which I mean, the tradition from which these artists are coming, and an unexpected subject. So this kind of encounter between a highly codified aesthetic and an unexpected chaotic subject that these artists need to make, particularly their struggles with drawing crowds and of people in cities, and in general, you know, the unpeopling of landscapes that we see in a lot of these artworks, except when the people are serving some sort of an aesthetic purpose. And by an aesthetic purpose, I suppose what I would mean is, you know, when basically human beings are used as a kind of comparative point of comparison with the scale of the sublime landscape within which they are placed. Some of the early painters whom we encounter in the archive, I mean, both at Victoria Memorial and elsewhere, particularly those of, I mean, not just landscape, but also portrait artists. I mean, the first two major artists come not through Calcutta, but through Madras. And one of the earliest is Tilly Kettle. And this I picked as a particularly interesting sort of painting, because we have the painting of Shujauddaulah by Tilly Kettle at the Victoria Memorial Hall. And it's a magnificent sort of painting done in the kind of chiaroscuro that Chattoshika was talking about, with this kind of high contrast of darkness and light. And this is an anonymous Lucknowi painter who has painted Tilly Kettle, painting like a Inception level artwork of Tilly Kettle painting Shujauddaulah and his 10 sons. So Tilly Kettle arrived in Madras in the late 1760s. One of the most successful of his ilk, he painted portraits, but also historical scenes that captured political as well as social realities. The other sort of significant early painter landscape artist to come was William Hodges. Hodges had trained under notable European painters like Richard Wilson, and this is one of Richard Wilson's paintings. I picked this because, you know, as we'll see as we go through these images, there are these similarities in terms of the composition and all, but it also kind of shows what I was trying to say about the use of human figures for scale. I mean, to create this sense of contrast between the smallness of human beings with respect to the grandeur of nature. So Hodges was trained under notable European painters like Richard Wilson, who painted in the picturesque tradition. The picturesque, as many of you know, was preoccupied with these kinds of twilight landscapes. They often use this thing called the Lorraine glass, right, which would create a kind of sepia tint. So like an Insta filter, which they would use to, figure out what the color palette of this of the landscape could be to produce this sort of an effect. The picturesque was preoccupied with twilight landscapes featuring overgrown foliage, rough and rugged terrain, architectural ruins, which inspired a sense of the sublime. And I remember writer and critic Ovikshen once describing this experience rather beautifully, where he said that, you know, this feeling of the sublime is a simultaneous feeling of the self expanding with the scale of nature as well as shrinking in relation or in comparison to it. So this kind of conflicted sense that we get, this aesthetic experience that we have of being in nature, of being of expanding and shrinking at the same time, that's something that the picturesque often tries to portray. Let's see what Hodges's first sort of experience of India was like. He's coming, as I said, he's coming through Madras. He says, the English town rising from within Fort St. George has from the sea a rich and beautiful appearance. The houses being covered with a stucco called chundam. The style of the buildings is in general handsome. They consist of long colonnades with open porticos and flat roofs, and offer to the eye an appearance familiar to what we may conceive of a Grecian city in the age of Alexander. The clear blue cloudless sky, the polished white buildings, the bright sandy beach, and the dark green sea present a combination totally new to the eye of an Englishman just arrived from London, who, accustomed to the sight of rolling masses of clouds floating in a damp atmosphere, cannot but contemplate the difference with delight. And then a little while later, he says, sometime before the ship arrives at her anchoring ground, she is hailed by the boats of the country, filled with people of business who come in crowds on board. This is the moment in which an European feels the great distinction between Asia and his own country. The rustling of fine linen, the general hum of unusual conversation presents to his mind for a moment the idea of an assembly of females. Random gendered remark for some reason, but let's get on with it. We notice a conflict in his experience between the familiar and the unfamiliar. Having identified it as an English town, Hodges recognizes the architectural features like the long colonnades with open porticos and flat roofs, but not as something from his own times. You know, it's but an aesthetic and constructed memory of ancient Greece. The natural elements are significantly different, but they are pleasing to the eye of an Englishman. As the ship reaches shore, however, this picturesque and Orientalist vision is bombarded with a different sensory, that of sound. No longer the classical crashing waves that echo from Homer's time, or the quietness of, the accented by the babbling brooks of the picturesque imagination, but the hum of unusual conversation. It gives us pause to reflect on how we hear European landscape art, and like, for instance, this one by Richard Wilson. What is the kind of auditory experience that we are supposed to have while looking at this? Is it something that we are experiencing in silence? Is it something where we are experiencing with the chirping of birds, with, like I said, the babbling of brooks, or is it, I don't know. And that experience is it's a significant break from this to suddenly come to a landscape where you're bombarded with these sounds and kind of a cacophony in a certain sense. A few days into his stay, however, the Anglo-Mysore War broke out in 1780, and refugees started pouring into the city. In 3 days, between 18th and 21st of July, Hodges reported there were nearly 200,000 people who sought refuge in the Black Town of Madras. He decided to move to Calcutta shortly thereafter, but not before painting a few landscapes. He writes, "The opportunities that offer to a painter are few in a country which is overrun by an active enemy. I made, however, among others, a drawing of Marmalong Bridge, which is a very modern work built, as I am informed, at the private expense of an Armenian merchant." So this is the artwork that he's talking about. And except for the presence of this one, sepoy in the foreground, the landscape is completely undisturbed by any sign of war. I mean, it could as well be one of Wilson's landscapes, that kind of silence, that sense of scale, of the humans with respect to nature. Of course, now there's a new modern bridge that has come up to kind of divide that landscape in two halves. Except for the presence of the sepoy, the landscape is undisturbed by any sign of war. Later, when the uncle and nephew pair, whom Dr. Sengupta also mentioned earlier today, which is Thomas and William Daniel, when they came to India and started retracing Hodges's footsteps, they too would encounter a similar situation in Srinagar. So this is the painting in Srinagar. I'll come back to this. But first we have their sketch of the Marmalong Bridge that Hodges had painted. So on the left-hand side, you see their pencil sketch, and on the right is the print that eventually comes out as part of their Oriental Scenery in 1798. And then this scene. And it's interesting because often this question of crowds and this kind of overpopulated landscape is tied to questions of war and or battles or political unrest in general. I mean, as we saw with Hodges and now with Thomas and William Daniel. I mean, if you look at this painting, the first thing that comes to mind is not that these are these are people being displaced by some sort of a war, but as it happened when Thomas and William Daniel reached Srinagar, Raja Pradyumna Shah was at war with the neighboring Raja of Kumaon, and he asked the Daniels for their help. The king is supposed to have asked for this help, effectively causing them to flee, and they decided, not to meddle with this art for art's sake and all of that. And Daniels writes that the river is here too rapid to be passed even by boats, and therefore the bridge of ropes that you can see offered the only means for the Raja and his people to effect their retreat. Unlike the Daniels' Oriental Scenery, which contained very brief descriptions of places, Hodges's travels was primarily a written record, a travelogue, illustrated with engravings of his paintings. Now, the question that intrigues me at this point is that, if you read or if you look at Hodges's paintings without reference to this text, what do we get out of it? And how does the experience of looking at these artworks after you read, go back and read what exactly was happening, how does that change our perception of these artworks? There were, however, some artists who who were more comfortable with painting crowds and large conglomerations of people. One of them, the name which has come up frequently over the last two talks, was Francois Balthazar Solvins, who primarily was an ethnographer. I mean, not maybe a proto-ethnographer, either way, but he was primarily engaged in this kind of documentation of the people of Hindustan. And this is his representation of a Hindu bazaar, and you can see there is a certain amount of chaos here. But then the point about this is that Solvins is not primarily a landscape artist. I mean, these are among a few exceptions where he paints either social organizations or commercial organizations that are heavily peopled. There aren't very many artworks which shows an urban landscape or a rural landscape or any landscape indeed where you see a multitude. The other one was, of course, Charles Doyley, who painted and wrote several collections of poetry of these urban landscapes, including the hilarious Tom Raw, the Griffin, which records in comic verse the experience of a newcomer to Bengal. Although his views of Calcutta and its environs, this is one of those, was published posthumously in 1848. There is some commitment to chaos in his vision, and but I wonder how much of this may have had to do with the fact that Doyley, unlike the others, was born and I mean, he worked for the largest, I mean, for the substantial part of his life in Bengal. He was born in Murshidabad. And although there was a certain crucial phase in which he received education in Britain. Another remarkable sort of case is that of James Bailey Fraser, who was a Scottish artist, writer who came to Calcutta and who painted several sort of striking urban landscapes featuring Indians and British citizens alike. Not sure if citizens is the technically correct word for describing the kind of relationship between people and the state at that point, but yeah, people of the city, let's say. Fraser was a Scottish painter and writer who came to India in search of a livelihood after his family's sugar plantation in the West Indies collapsed. After a few failed ventures, James Bailey Fraser turned to his brother William for support, who had made his way up the ranks of the East India Company to become the agent to the Governor General during the rule of Bahadur Shah Zafar. And sometime in 1814 or 1815, James Bailey Fraser goes up to join his brother in Himachal Pradesh. And once again, there is a kind of political turmoil going on. And suddenly in the midst of this, he finds inspiration. I'll just quote this rather interesting passage. So this is where he goes and meets his brother. You can see this is a relatively, I mean, you see more markers of some sort of political unrest here dotting the landscape with these tents. And I don't know whether those are, I mean, that smoke coming from guns, I don't know, or whether those are very low clouds. There are people in military attire as well. And this is how he describes this first flash of inspiration. When at Jitok with General Martindale's army, I got seized with the desire to delineate some of the objects that there met our view. And imagine there's a war going on, and the first impulse was in an odd place in our batteries, when really it was not quite pleasant, for the enemy's shots were playing over our heads quite briskly. We were behind a wall, however. I proposed taking a sketch of the stockade we were battering, and then followed some of the irregular soldiers, all of which crude attempts you shall one day see. This is, I mean, it's kind of war journal. It's not really war journalism. It's just a slightly nutty painter who's landed up on the scene of this battle. When the devil of drawing broke loose, there was no holding him, and he's unable to contain the devil of drawing that has suddenly, you know, taken over him, and this kind of a critical moment. And William must have been a patient older brother. James, having almost completed a sketch of Gangotri, wrote in his notebook that I'm still not satisfied. I'll come back to this slide in a bit, otherwise it's distracting. Almost completed a scene of Gangotri, he wrote that I'm not still satisfied with it, but will not do more toil till I have the advantage of seeing some watercolor drawings from which I may take a lesson. Interestingly, William had used his good offices to hire a native artist to take the likeness of several of the servants and Gorkhas. So this is a very interesting case where this kind of, I mean, James Bailey Fraser, he goes, he tries to paint, he realizes his limitation, and then to overcome the limitation, they hire a native painter to kind of show them how these figures can be drawn. And eventually, William's patience with his brother kind of wore thin. He says that I heard from James today, he's gone crazed after drawings and notes, and to execute all his commissions would employ a man's life. However, I'm doing as much for him as I can manage by the agency of stiff Delhi draftsmen. I love this phrase. I have got a good painter of figures, portraits and groups, but a landscape painter is not indigenous to Hindustan. I sent James the other day 40 paintings of figures, etc., which I may hope he may be able to get transmitted to you. This is a letter that I'm quoting, and it's interesting because this also kind of brings together these different traditions that are coming together. I mean, there is the landscape painting that's supposedly a Western tradition in this kind of a sense. There is this realistic drawing of humans by Indian artists. But this also is something, I mean, what critics nowadays are, I mean, the verdict is still out on that, but people are moving away from the phrase of company painters, because these are Indian painters after all, and the kind of skills that these artists picked up and from European art and from the miniature traditions that they inherited, and then that coming back to this European artist who's trying to merge that with his skills as a landscape painter. So the efforts on the whole, I would say, proved worthwhile. This is James Bailey Fraser painting the scene of the bazaar, Chitpur Bazaar, and this is this has come a long way since Daniels and Hodges and the early sort of depictions of the Calcutta cityscape, which are very, where the people are kind of just again fulfilling an aesthetic function to highlight the grandeur of colonial architecture. I'll close with one anecdote from a later period. In 1873, this is almost 100 years since William Hodges has arrived in India. A person who we know much better as a limerick writer, as a poet of absurd nonsense verse, Edward Lear came to Bengal, and in his observations about Calcutta, however, were not very charitable. I think one of the things that may have influenced Edward Lear is that he may have taken this kind of unpeopled landscape painting too seriously and believed that that is what India is supposed to be like. He describes the Chaurangi area as, I quote, a road of palaces and a fearful humbug. The promenade des Anglais at Nice beats it hollow. Unnecessary comparison, but anyway. So like Hodges before him, Lear was unused to the volume of ambient noise. He called the city Hustle Fasabad. And when he tried to find a quiet spot to paint the riverfront, he complained in his notebooks, immense commerce and population of Calcutta Ghats, for which I was not prepared. So he takes off to Tollygunge. That's kind of the southern extreme of the city. Here you can see the kind of landscape that he has finally felt comfortable with. He goes off to Tollygunge in the southern extreme of the city. He writes, drove to Tollygunge, beautiful bits of village and verdure. I do not think I ever before saw so much novel, interesting and drawable stuff. This is also an interesting phrase, drawable stuff, in so small a space and so short a time. The frequency of masjids that he saw in the Tollygunge area, mosques, prompted him to call it Moscopolis. To capture the city's hustle and bustle, however, what he does, having failed to paint the hustle and bustle, but still to have that kind of fidelity to what he actually saw, he goes to Bourne and Shepherd and purchases a bunch of photographs. And I'll close here because how landscape influenced photography, how landscape painting influenced photography, that's probably a discussion for another day and another project. So thank you. And yeah, we'll maybe go into some questions after this.
Thank you, Shujan, for this really wonderful presentation. And I think one of the things I loved about all the presentations was the range of paintings we have actually dealt with. Starting from ethnographic sketches like solvents depicting craftspeople or ayahs to, let's say, conversation pieces by Zofani, to landscape paintings, to paintings of cityscape cities. I think we have covered a really wonderful range of paintings and various kinds of artistic trends and traditions. And I think we have also been able to trace some sorts of transition. The kinds of paintings, let's say, as prepared in the 1760s to 70s, to, let's say, how the artistic modes change as actually the 19th century progresses. So I think that's also something we have been able to trace quite clearly. So I think we can now actually discuss there are in fact quite a few things to discuss. Like I'm curious about quite a few of them. So I think we should begin with the questions actually. So Arundhati Ghosh has actually asked the question. I noticed none of the ayahs look straight at the camera in the examples you showed us. Was that significant? Do you have any insight on that? And camera is in, like, of course, the painter's eye.
Yes, thank you, Arundhati, for this question. This is part of the painting convention, like right from the 17th century, 18th century in European art, black and brown slaves and servants were being depicted. And, like I pulled up, a few more to show you. Can you guys see this? Sorry. Yeah, so it's not just Indian ayahs, but if you look at, enslaved black boys, like even adults were called boys in this time, and you can see they rarely engage with the viewer, right? The main subject, who is the British or European subject, usually stares back at the spectator confidently, whereas the black or brown enslaved or servant individual kind of looks up at the employer or the master or the mistress, right? In all these paintings, you can see that. And that is similar, so European painters like Joshua Reynolds and others who had never been to India were probably influenced by this convention of European portraiture of black and brown bodies. And just like these black enslaved individuals, even Indian ayahs in the late 18th century were more like exotic objects, curiosity, commodities, right? They were indicating the wealth, fashionable tastes, and the imperial connections of their patrons. And looking up at the viewer would kind of endow them with subjecthood. So they would rise from objects to subjects in the paintings, which was not the purpose, which was not their function in the painting, where they were supposed to be representations of empire and imperial objects. And, like with even after the arrival of the camera, this convention did not really change much. If you look at, colonial photography from the late 1800s or early 1900s, in family photographs, once again, you see this convention being reproduced, where ayahs and even other Indian men servants do not really engage with the viewer, but look up to their masters or mistresses, and the main British subjects look back at the viewer.
Yes, now, we also have a question for Shujan. So, Onjishnu is asking, Shujan, Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation. All the paintings you shared, in addition to having lesser crowd and more neutral space, also seem very subtle in terms of choice of color. We almost see no bright color used in them, but India, in fact, is supposed to be a very colorful country to the Western gaze because of its exotic essence. So can you elaborate a bit on this?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Onjishnu. That's a very valid observation, I think. Before sort of answering that, I just want to quickly show you a few postcards from a much later period that do kind of have that. And these were done by this artist called, no, I'm not going to play right now. Wait, I get rid of this. Sorry, this seems to be. Yeah, so these are the works by this artist called Frank Klinger-Scalan, who was here in Calcutta in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's, I mean, I also agree with you that there is kind of a lack of this kind of vibrant color palette that we see. In Scalan, we see a lot of this, there is, I mean, not just in terms of the kind of clothes that people wear, but yeah, this kind of, foliage and this kind of flowering trees is really not so much a standard feature of painting in the late 18th and early 19th or mid 19th centuries. Part of the reason for that, I would sorry, yeah, just got distracted by the other question. Part of the reason for that, I would say, is that that a lot of these artists, including Hodges and Daniels, I mean, whether they are consciously, I mean, the Daniels, especially this question has come up that, you know, are they consciously using the picturesque language of art, or are they, you know, making things up as they go along, using, I mean, collecting different idioms from different kinds of artistic traditions. But usually within the picturesque tradition, there is this kind of very heavy reliance on a kind of subtle brownish, ochreish type of color scheme. And part of that, like I was saying during my talk, was because, you know, some of the people who kind of pioneered this movement, like William Gilpin, for instance, they would often use this thing called a Lorraine glass to paint. And this Lorraine glass would actually kind of, like I was saying, it's kind of like an insta filter in that sense that the reflection that you see of the landscape on the Lorraine glass has a particular color tonality to it. And that color tonality was seen as something that could, in this stylistic way, be used to represent a certain affective relationship with the landscape, and it kind of created a very specific sort of mood and tone to these paintings. And within that, I mean, I don't know honestly about what kinds of printing ink they were also using, or what kinds of stuff they were using to hand tint the paintings that were reproduced as lithographs. But I suspect, because I mean, it's not necessarily a question of the printing ink, because even in the paintings themselves, what you're saying is absolutely true, in that these colors are not really there. What is interesting for me also is that there seems to be a kind of bifurcation here of textual traditions and of the visual tradition, because these colors are very much the part of, you know, what we see in travelogues and write-ups about this time, as is true with of say the sound quality that Hodges talks about. Again, these are things that, you know, are there in the textual tradition, but may not be so well represented in the visual tradition. So these would be my suggestions. But again, I'm not an art historian, so I can't really say conclusively what I mean, the reason behind this. But thanks for that question.
I was also wondering if we might also kind of, you know, think of a political motive. I mean, not of course, like whether it's conscious or unconscious, that's a different thing. Like, as you pointed out, of course, this is a part of a particular aesthetic tradition, which is why certain kinds of colors are used. But I think even politically speaking, for instance, the way Hodges, I mean, he obsessively depicted ruins, particularly in North India. I mean, ruins of mosques. Apparently, wherever he went, he found ruins. And even in the accompanying, I think it's near Delhi. He actually accompanies the painting with the caption that, you know, it's completely, I think, Agra or Delhi, it's completely now in ruins, and see how kind of Islamic rule has, I mean, see what it has done to India. So, I mean, do you think it also kind of very subtly went into this kind of political messaging that India is now anyway a land of ruins, that, you know, now it's kind of time for the British to take over? And of course, this is a time when the East India Company was aggressively expanding. So,
yeah, could be. I don't know. I mean, for that, I think one has to compare how, I mean, the use of color in landscapes where this political agenda wasn't there, and to see whether there's a change between, I mean, whether there's a difference between the two. That might give us some clues as to that, but it's certainly worth exploring. Yeah.
There's another question from Ramya Ramesh to everyone. Thank you for the excellent analysis of all the paintings. Now, for the panelists, were there any attempts to change the perception of Indian life or people through art by Indian artists post-independence? Now, of course, I think if I would also like to add a similar question, I mean, something which struck me in Shotoshika's presentation was when you talked about Zainuddin, and how he also kind of tried to master some of the techniques of the European painters. I mean, he was trained in a very different Mughal courtly tradition. So, like, of course, Indian artists post-independence and even pre-independence, let's say in the 19th century, the Indian artists who were kind of, you know, following in the wake of the European painters. So do you think like they were trying to, in a sense, contest the kinds of visual representation of India presented by Europeans? So both, of course, pre-independence, post-independence.
Yeah, I feel like rather than contesting, like they were actually reproducing many of the conventions that we see in European paintings, particularly, in the company, what was called company paintings or Indian painters painting for East Indian Company officers. Even though they were trained in Mughal courtly style, many of them were adopting European sense of like perspective, proportion, depth, right? Like even the colors, like they were muting the color palette instead of bright colors, which we see in Mughal paintings or from Awadh or, the Deccan or Rajput courts. You can see the color palette is becoming much more subdued in, these paintings when they're painting for a European clientele. And also thinking about the late colonial period, when Indian painters were depicting Indian women, or even like, subaltern women like ayahs or other servants, actually something interesting that I've found in my, I've written about this also in my dissertation, is like in the early 1900s. If you look at, the works of Ravi Verma or Abanindranath, you can see them kind of reproducing the racialized relationship between mistresses and maids, even though, like in European paintings or, these British artists who were depicting the British mistress and the Indian ayah, they're juxtaposing their racial difference, a stark contrast between the British whiteness and the ayah's darkness. We can see that being reproduced in Ravi Verma's paintings, for instance, when the upper caste mistress, who is a South Asian, she's still depicted in with light skin tone, and often like this unknown source of light falls upon her. And the maid servants, who are usually of lower caste, they are often depicted, in the background or on the margins, and in some kind of shadow is falling on them to make them look darker. So this kind of racialization, the visual production of race and class difference, which we see in European paintings, I feel they're reproduced rather than challenged by Indian painters.
Just to come in on that, Shatrika, absolutely, I agree with you about particularly, I mean, there is certainly that kind of replication there. Also, I think it might be, projecting into the past to think of resistance at that stage. I mean, it's a very different sort of relationship than one that we would imagine from our present vantage point, or indeed from a post-colonial vantage point. And to answer Ramya Ramesh's question, I mean, of course there were, and to begin with, you have, the whole kind of, on the one hand, there is through replication, as Shoptoshika said, a kind of, trying to, elevate oneself into a certain kind of visual tradition through visual representations that's happening, particularly with the royalty, as you said, with Raja Ravi Verma, or this kind of whole tradition of portrait paintings where Indian subjects are also hiring portrait artists. When photography comes, they're using similar techniques to project themselves in a certain way. But also I feel that, after a point, there is a certain break where Indian art, modern Indian art, so to speak, also, just tries to go off and build its own discourses without necessarily taking a post-colonial or anti-racial position on it. I mean, if we think of the the art, the paintings and the linocuts of say Nandalal Boshu, and that for me is one of the very kind of interesting counterpoints to the kind of Solvins representation, where during 1936-37, for the 1937 Haripura Congress, when Gandhi asks Nandalal to kind of paint the people of India, and this is a project that Solvins has done. This is a project that has happened under Canning, of representing the people of India, and Nandalal takes that up and he gives it a completely different sort of spin, and it's the same sort of a ethnographic project, but with which kind of talks back and makes it so much more lively and so much more interesting artistically as well when he does that whole series. But even apart from that, if we are thinking of not just post-independence, but generally even pre-independence, if you think of the, say, kind of depictions of rural life that, again, Nandulal and all of these people come up with, and then the kind of breaking of that which happens with, say, someone like Chittu Prasad or Zainul Abedin and all of that. I think there is a very different idiom that develops, not necessarily as a response, but in a very powerful tradition of its own, which is taken forward not just through this, but through photography and even film after a point. So, yeah.
If I could quickly add to what Shujan said, of course, I completely agree. I mean, this is also the period of growing anti-colonial nationalism, and we know that Indian nationalist art was responding to and fashioning itself as very different from European art, right? But at the same time, I feel like, at least in some of the family portraits, I feel like it's not just a response or a counter to European conventions, but kind of replacing the European figures with upper caste elite Indian individuals in these family portraits, and the depiction of servants kind of remains similar. But of course, the broader arguments you make, Shujan, are
no, absolutely. I mean, the social power structures kind of get replaced by even in political terms, that tends to happen a bit. Yeah. Thanks.
Actually, I had a question, and by the way, Tathagata has actually left because he was not feeling unwell. So he has informed that he will be leaving the meeting. So, Shuttoshika and Shujan, so for both of you actually. So I was wondering about, revisiting the paintings today, or let's say, because from the standpoint of the present, when we actually go back to these paintings, of course, a lot has happened in the intervening 200 years. So we have entirely new media like photography, film, these have come up. So the kind of visual cultures of representation, these are vastly changed. So now when we kind of revisit the paintings today, either let's say in a museum setting or anyhow, so how do we recontextualize them? I mean, do we kind of look at them as ethnographic sources merely? I mean, let's say these give us a lot of information about what life was then like. Or let's say, do we kind of, there's a powerful tradition in post-colonialism to look at the power dynamics about how, let's say, the subject, object, these things. So what are the ways in which we can recontextualize those paintings when we revisit them today, in the 21st century? If you could just...
Shujan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a very well-formed answer, so I'll just take a stab at it nonetheless. Arjun, I think what the kind of research that Shuttoshika is doing and the kind of presentation that she made, I feel is a very fine case in point of the kind of recontextualizing this kind of ethnography and all of that. Because I mean, and something that I was also mentioning in my presentation is that it's not just an archive of ethnography, but it's an archive of the gaze and the way in which that changes. And that itself, I feel, to factor that in is an important part of how we look at these artworks today. And also to kind of, what I was trying to gesture towards through my talk is also questioning the assumptions which we have internalized because of this very long visual tradition. Very long and very powerful. I mean, one doesn't have necessarily to see solvents to internalize some of the features that are significant. I mean, that emerge from his artworks. There is also a question of how these artworks are displayed and curated, but I'll come to that later. So maybe Shuttoshika, if you want to add to that or qualify that.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to, point to some of the interesting, paintings that I've been seeing recently displayed here in museums. For instance, at the Yale Center for British Art, if you look, I mean, this famous painting of Elihu Yale with the unnamed Black slave or servant boy on the margins, right? Like this for a long time was displayed uncritically. He was just supposed to be this Black or brown boy, who had no name, whose provenance was unknown. But recently, an African-American artist has kind of redone, has taken that Black boy out and done his own portrait. I can't find the entire thing, but you can see kind of given him subjecthood from his object status. And this kind of thing I'm noticing here quite a lot. Like there was another exhibition here at the Bainbridge Center, which is part of Princeton University, where this, the mammy figure in a lot of American paintings from around the early 19th century, mid 19th century, who was similar to the figure of the ayah depicted on the margins, always in service to the white family. Now they're being placed center stage in the painting. So like kind of recontextualizing and helping us, think about these figures, not just as, not just as marginal to the imperial families that they served, but, in their own terms, giving them agency and subjecthood, which is quite interesting, I think.
Absolutely. And I think it's, and this is a really wonderful example of, thanks for pulling that up.
Fascinating, actually.
Yeah. I was also thinking that, there's one, what it also gestures towards is this kind of, of a public performative role, in a sense that these artworks can potentially have, in the sense that interpretation can happen at various levels. In the sense that, of course, we can interpret these images and we can write about them, and that continues in any kind of criticism of that. But also in terms of how they are curated, and that also for me becomes a very important part of this kind of a project of reinterpreting them, because there are a few aspects to this, in fact, which we kind of were very conscious of while we were trying to, make the DAG collection available at the Currency Building in Kolkata. And one which was necessitated, unfortunately, by the pandemic, was to think of the museum as a, as a virtual space where you could actually imagine n number of narratives through online representation, social media, and so on, by bringing different artworks in conversation with each other, rather than showing the artworks in the same sequence that they are shown on the walls. So basically breaking the usual chronological kind of narrative and cross-reading, like Shotoshika has also done with her work, and that, kind of opens up different perspectives on artworks that that may not have been available very easily before that. And the other also is to kind of create different narratives through engagements and through programming and through walks and so on. Because I think, one of the walks that I was particularly, thrilled about at Ghore Baire was one that was done by this illustrator and artist called Alisha Dutt Islam, who kind of looked at the paintings in the collection and said that, these are a fascinating archive of colonial botany. So she basically created a walk around the Dalhousie area, around that entire neighborhood, and which was connecting the artworks to what we were seeing out there, and pointing out the trees in the area, and the period at which there's also a huge botanical colonization that happens in this entire larger project, right? So basically, which trees were of native origin, which trees were brought in at what point by which community, and the kind of environmental impact that had. So it was, and that kind of, going back to the artworks after that, you just, suddenly these details become not just incidental, but actually, very real in a sense. When you suddenly realize that, okay, so there is a reason why, and this is one of the questions which, also this point about why they are not very colorful, is that one of the things that Alisha was actually pointing out about a lot of these artworks is that sometimes you don't see those brightly colored flowering trees at that period, because many of them were brought in by the British and through different processes of colonialism. So it's, which is not to say there were no coloring trees. Of course, there were coloring trees, but the significant canopy, the canopy, which is to say the tree cover, is the foliage that covers a city. She claims that there is a significant change that happens during the colonial period, from being one that is relatively subdued to one that is very brightly colored with these flowers that flourish on tropical soil. So I think, yeah, re-narrativizing and re-curating are also kind of interesting ways of taking that forward.
And using other kinds of archives, right? Like
Absolutely,
reading the
absolutely.
visual archive with other forms
Yeah.
of, official archives, textual archives. I think that also helps us contextualize. For instance, Ramia's question about, the perception of Indian people. Like, do these paintings really tell us anything about the Indian craftsmen? As not about is things shown on the Indian servants or the Indian people in crowds. Like, really, we don't really know. It's more about European perceptions of Indians, not the social history of Indians. We can't get, right, like from these paintings. But I think, like using other archives to kind of find that out while displaying or understanding the visual can be productive.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, like personally, I remember I had long been very fascinated by this painting of the Colonel Palmer and his family, like prepared in the 1790s and Faiz Baksh. Now, for the longest time, I just used to look at the painting. I didn't know much about who the people were actually. And then, of course, I read Dalrymple's book and how he has actually presented an entire narrative by looking just at a different set of archives. So instead of, like, of course, the visual, like the pictures themselves, they give us certain information, even about a lot of like the ayahs you actually depicted. Like, one wonders what their perspective, their lives would have been like. So maybe if we actually look at like, other kinds of documents, like in vernaculars or others, so maybe we can actually find information about them as well. So I think that also would be a very fascinating thing.
Absolutely.
So Ramya, Ramesh, thanks all of you for like the discussion, and I'm absolutely intrigued at the potential of art to create or recreate the idea of a place and the people, which is something we have been discussing for past several minutes. So if there are any other questions.
Arjun, I'm assuming there are no questions on Facebook, right?
No, I don't think so, because
Okay.
Koirobini has been kind of looking at them. I think in that case, we can call it a day. It's kind of 8. So like, again, like, thanks all of you, like Tathagata again, even though he's not here. So thanks all of you for like the really wonderful presentations. And I think the vast variety of paintings we have actually looked at. So hopefully we'll have the opportunity to meet again later on as well, even after, let's say, the project ends. So again, I really look forward to all of you, and thanks to all the audience, to Dr. Sengupta, Arundhati Ghosh, Ritvika. Thanks to all of you as well for joining. And I look forward to seeing all of you later on.
Thank you. Thank you, Arjun.
Thank
Thanks
you,
to all our...
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you for bringing this together. And before leaving, one thing, so I think Arjun's project really tried to have as its outcomes many public engagement, be it on his early social media posts and this conversation. He has as an outcome as the e-catalog also. So we all look forward to it. And thank you for having this conversation, Arjun.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Okay, so I have
did you say something?
Yeah, I have stopped the recording. So, and as for the live streaming, I think it's still live.
Yeah, so will it end once we stop the Zoom session is what I'm saying. So then we can just end the meeting.
Just ending the meeting now, because I think yeah, then it should automatically stop.
Oh yeah, okay, cool.